A maverick.
A maverick.
A maverick.
I don't know what you consider a maverick.
I suppose it's unique.
Different.
Somebody with a touch of genius.
Wild and crazy.
In between outlaw and the old west.
Supremely self-confident, occasionally misguided, but always interesting.
Either you're a maverick or you're not. That's the way it is. An artist.
George was just an entertainer. He wanted to play, he wanted to show people what a great player he was. And of course the fans loved it.
If you look back at the footballers of the 1950s, they were usually wearing suits and they were wearing ties, and they're normally at home, either washing up in the kitchen with their wives or they're kind of out in the back garden. It was a very formal kind of decade. Then, of course, in the 1960s, George comes along.
The game of football had changed in a way. People were getting over the war. There's the Beatles, the Stones, the hairstyle, the dress. I think football was coming into that bracket of being showbiz, really. George Best was probably the instigator.
He had just caught the very top of that wave, and he just rode it all the way through from, say, 1964 through to about 1969-70.
Apart from being a great footballer genius, he was a commercial property.
He became this sort of pop star footballer, which was totally new.
Truly gorgeous. I mean, oh, gorgeous.
He started to feature in the back pages because he was playing fantastic football. But he would be in the fashion pages in the middle. Sometimes, unfortunately, be on the front when he would make a bit of a mess of things.
I swear, if I walked into a room with George naked, nobody would see me. It was all eyes were on George. All eyes.
I hate making predictions about these things when a boy's so young, but this boy has got everything to make a great player. And some little time ago, Tom Finney thought he was the best young player he's seen for many years, and I agree with him.
George Best was just 15 years old when he was spotted playing football in Belfast by Manchester United scout Bob Bishop. A trial impressed the United directors, and Best signed. He moved to Manchester in 1961, settling into digs with his new landlady, Mrs. Fullaway.
Lads were leaving home. I would think in George's case for the first time that he'd left home for any period of time. It was a great responsibility on the landladies, I guess a lot of football clubs, but certainly at United. So it was very exciting, you know, all the training and playing, starting to learn the trade and living in a great city like Manchester.
I was playing in a five-a-side with small goals, and this kid came up and put the ball past me, and I didn't know what had happened. And he did it again. And he did it the third time, and I said, son, you do that again, and I'll break your neck.
Even the established players that were already at the club at the time, they could tell right, I think from the very early days that there was something special about him.
The confidence the senior players had in the youngster was not misplaced. Best made his debut in September 1963, aged just 17, making an immediate impact on the Old Trafford faithful.
He had a quality and he had a control that really was unparalleled. He could control the ball, his left foot, his right foot, it was not a great problem to him. He could turn on a sixpence. He had an unbelievable vision. He could tell everything that was happening around. He knew exactly where people were. And that gave him all the time that he needed to actually express himself.
He had the most fantastic ability to play football. But he played in derby games or any match internationals. He played as if he was playing on the Wreck or in the road in Belfast.
George had such skill, such remarkable skill, and he had the ability as well to be able to tackle. I mean, he was as hard as handmade nails.
We played in derby games against him at Old Trafford, and he'd be outside 10 minutes before the kick-off, signing autographs, talking to somebody. You know, many times he'd run on the field tying his bootlaces or pulling his socks up.
He was just an entertainer. He wanted to play, he wanted to show people what a great player he was. And of course the fans loved it.
Football to him was just an everyday occurrence to him, and it didn't bother him because he just played the game of football he loved, and he was a genius. That's why he was a genius.
I always felt like an entertainer, but
And I knew I could get the crowd excited by doing little things and trying things differently. You know, if I was playing against a player in particular who was giving me a hard time, he was getting stuck in, you know, I would stand on the ball and ask him to come and get it off me, and the crowd went crazy. And I loved it, you know, it was great. To me, it was pure theatre. I did it. I did it on purpose, because I knew it got the crowd excited.
There was a team picture before the beginning of the 63-64 season, but of course George wasn't in the side then. By the end of that season, he was an absolute star. So they'd actually cut and sort of pasted his head onto someone else's head simply to get his picture in. The football magazines learnt that if you put George on the cover, they would sell more copies.
That first season at United propelled Best towards stardom. He was quickly becoming the most lauded footballer of his generation, but more importantly, he was recognised by the British youth as one of them, and he behaved accordingly.
George captured that era perfectly. He looked so different, but he actually looked like the kind of teenagers did in the 1960s or the early 1960s.
You know, we did what any young lads would do, I guess, in you know, in and around Manchester. We like to go out and have a drink and see the girls.
Most of the players at United were married, and most of the players at City were married.
After a game at Manchester United where it was like 60,000 people there, and you come back to a load of nappies on the washing line, you were really brought back to earth. Whereas, of course, Bestie was different. He was single.
For two people like George, who comes from Belfast and I came from Swindon, where everything closed at 10 o'clock, you can imagine the 60s in Manchester, mini skirts and, you know, pop groups around. It was just, we just had a good time, and that's what it was all about.
Everybody who was in the entertainment business went to Manchester. Of course, they would then go into the pubs and the bars afterwards, and that's when George would actually meet them.
Whether he was at home or I was away, we used to meet up at a certain time or a certain place, and we used to go from there. We used to drift into town, and then we'd go to the Piccadilly Club, and then we'd go to Dino's or Mr. Smith's, and then we'd just drift up farther down to the Garden of Eden, and then we'd go to the Cabaret Club, just in and out. We used to probably end up in the early hours of the morning on Sunday morning in Moss Side, in a place called Phyllis's, which was super, you know.
Still a teenager and now becoming known as an icon and heartthrob, unsurprisingly, the girls soon came calling for George.
We decided to get a little flat, and it was in an old Victorian house, so we just got the flat there, and it was where we could go at the weekends. And you know, if you're fortunate to have a girlfriend or your girls, you could go back there. So it was quite enjoyable.
There was only one bed. So as a consequence, if these two single guys picked up a woman first, then the first one back to the place actually got that bed.
They didn't come flocking round or anything, but they knew they were attracted to him. You know, they fancied him as they would do, and that's how life was.
He looks confident, but in the company of strangers, he actually wasn't. They used to walk into a room, and Mike would say, "Which one do you fancy? I'll go up and ask her for a date for you."
You would never go in a place and say, "Come over here." You know, if someone was brought into a conversation with us, then that's when you could talk to them, you know.
The alcohol probably came along and took away that shyness. But you see, even the shy man wasn't so shy that he couldn't walk down the steps into a nightclub all by himself, knowing that everybody was going to be looking and the cameras were rolling.
65 was the first year where Matt Busby had to say to him, "George, I think your nights are getting a bit too long here."
But Best was still performing superbly on the pitch. The league was won in 1965. And the following year saw George's fame hit new heights as Manchester United took on Benfica in the European Cup quarter-final.
That was the game that was to sort of mark, if you like, his arrival on the international scene.
That night was special, and that was a night that Bestie really came into his own. And the big hat, I think it was a bit of posing, really.
The team did well, he had a great game, and he became El Beetle. I'm the fellow said to him, "Take it off your head. Take it off your head. Great players don't need gimmicks."
That was the match, really, if there was a match that sort of turned things and turned George into, let's say, a superstar.
Because of that one kind of night, suddenly everything went wild. Mike Summerbury tells the tale of him coming back to Manchester and just heads had turned and cars had stopped and people are sounding their horns. From then, everything went absolutely mad.
People were stopping, old ladies, young ladies, older men, everybody, you know, wherever you walked down. And he just signed his autographs and carried on. It didn't really affect him, you know.
Nobody understood the level of fame that he was experiencing and the amount of hassle that he was getting because of it.
One or two of the more senior players in the squad maybe didn't take too kindly to it at first.
Matt Busby thought, even in those early days when George was getting 5,000 to 10,000 letters per week, that you know, it would kind of come and it would flare and then it would just flash out. But of course, George's fame never actually died.
With more football being shown on television in the mid-1960s, companies were realising that footballers could be used to sell their products. And agent Ken Stanley knew full well his client George Best would fit their criteria perfectly.
George was the first footballer who went outside the boundaries of his sport. So he was a pin-up and he was a pop idol. He just had that kind of fashion star look about him.
So many people at that particular time, not only women, but also people that wanted to be associated with him.
It takes a lot to get George Best away from football. But one thing always works, his mum's cooking, especially when it's Cookstown sausages.
What the man means is Cookstown are the best family sausages.
I counted up, I think, that there were 87 different products that George was advertising by about 1968. There were George hair products, George clothes, George pyjamas, bath robes, bath towels, lamps, literally anything had his name on it.
And even his Vegas wedding became a commercial venture.
I remember going to sit next to George on the plane, and his agent said, "No, you can't sit here." I said, "Why?" "Well, because we've done a deal with the Daily Mirror." When we got to the airport, we had to go in separate cars to the wedding chapel.
Off the pitch, life was wonderful for George Best, and on the pitch, things were even better. Manchester United won the league in 1967, meaning another adventure in the European Cup. They would go on to reach the final, where once again they met Benfica.
Looking back on it, we perhaps should have won in 90 minutes. But we could also have lost it.
Alex Stepney had saved a shot from Eusebio. When we went into extra time, we overran them.
And we ran out, obviously, 4-1 winners. And
in that split second between going past them and it going in the net, something might go wrong. And I was going to stop in the line and backing it in, and I didn't. I stuck it around. It took the rest of the boys about 20 minutes to catch me after that.
United scored 2 more to run out 4-1 winners over the Portuguese side. Best was only 22 and was later named European Player of the Year. That European Cup win, the first for an English side, should have been the launchpad for bigger and better things. However, that's not how things were to pan out.
George expected and hoped that the team would lift from there. Winning the European Cup should have been the start of something. It wasn't, because I don't think the team were preparing as well for the future then as perhaps they had done in the past. And so, you know, there was a decline for the team. And that sort of coincided very much alongside the problems that started to emerge with George.
I think George wanted the team changed quickly so that they could keep that success up, but it didn't happen, and you know, things started going wrong with George.
Most people think that kind of drinking ended his football life, whereas actually it was his football life that led to his drinking.
As United started to decline, Best became frustrated. Off the pitch, the lifestyle and media attention he had courted suddenly became a burden, as life in a goldfish bowl took its toll.
If you're in places where they're serving drink, you get in fights sooner or later. You know, if you drive fast cars, sooner or later you're going to have a bang in it. But if you're a personality, it's different. You know, it really is, particularly in this country.
George thought it would be a great idea to get several high kind of quality cars. The problem was that they were so kind of recognisable, especially in the 1960s, because they were expensive, and so people would recognise that it was his. And you know, girls would scratch their telephone numbers on the side of the door, or if he stopped at a red light, you know, someone would just pile on top of the boot. Yeah, it's just an absolutely crazy sort of situation.
I never forget, press people are coming towards us, and I see this man all of a sudden go, and they just descended on him. This man went like this, and I thought, my first thought was, uh-oh.
One of the mistakes George made was actually buying his own house. George was persuaded to have a very nice modernist house. The only problem was it didn't offer him any privacy whatsoever. On Sundays, he would find that whole coach loads of people would turn up at this place, and they used to have picnics on his lawn. It just seems bizarre. And that's when it ceased to be fun, because when he went home, he expected it to be his castle, whereas actually it was a kind of peep show, really.
Busby retired in 1969, but replacements Wilf McGuinness and then Franco Farrell didn't earn best respect, and new players brought in weren't up to the standard he expected. Frustration grew, training sessions were missed, drinking sessions increased, and decline started to set in.
He does get a bit thicker, and he starts to grow his beard. He's more in the papers then, I suppose, on the front pages than he is on the back pages.
I think he found the burden of being the superstar, and the expectancy on him in matches got a little bit too much for him, I think.
I've looked back at some of those times at the end of the 60s and into the early part of the 70s, when a lot of this must have all sort of started, I guess, and you know, you think, well, why didn't I see it? Why didn't I spot it? Why wasn't I able to see it and do something about it?
There were still occasional moments of magic, but they were few and far between. In 1972, after numerous suspensions, fines, and hiding out in Marbella, the 26-year-old Best made the explosive decision to retire. But was he serious?
Well, here to answer that question, George Best. Are you really not ever going to play football again, George?
No, people keep asking me and saying, well, you must come back and you're going to come back. But I made a decision almost a year ago, and I changed my mind then, but this time I won't.
The yearning to play was too much, and Best returned for new manager Tommy Docherty. But the end was sadly inevitable, and in January 1974, it all came to a head.
He understood that once in a while that, you know, I went out and had a late night or got involved with this and that. He said as long as it didn't affect the way I played, that he wouldn't turn a blind eye, but if I missed training, say for instance, if I missed training, I came back in the afternoon and I did twice as much. That was sort of the gentleman's agreement. Tommy Docherty told me about an hour before kick-off that I wasn't playing. And I said, well, what happened to the, why? And he said, because you missed training Thursday morning. And I just said to him, well, if I don't play today, I won't play again. I sat there until all the players had gone. I went and sat up in the stand and looked at the pitch, and I never went back.
It just leaves a terribly sad image, really, of what might have been, because George was still so young then.
Best left England for a fresh start in America and the LA Aztecs. A new country, a new team, and a new love, as he met English model Angie Janes.
So we're sitting there chatting at the bar, and this girl walks up to us and throws a drink at me. What was that for? It was his girlfriend. You think, in hindsight, you think, okay, leave now, never go back. Nah, that was too easy. He so thoroughly enjoyed his time in LA because we had a little apartment on the beach. He got to play a match in a field that had no borders, and it enabled him to play, train, then go down to his bar, get drunk, sleep on the beach. He had the best of both worlds. Oh, I can remember throwing buckets of water over him in the morning. If he had a hangover, he played an even better game than he did without one. Because he tried that much harder, bless him.
He went to America and he scored that fantastic goal in America when he beat about 7 players in the box and put it in the net, and everyone thought, well, you know, he's got his head on here. He may come back and have one last really go at it. But unfortunately, it didn't happen.
Everybody talks about the wondrous goal that he scored, where he seemed to beat half the team 3 or 4 times before putting it in the net. I think for George it was nowhere near Manchester United, and it was very sad that he was doing that at a time when he should have still been playing in the English League.
Best did return to the English League, having a spell with Rodney Marsh at 2nd Division Fulham, but his career dwindled away. Spells at the likes of Stockport, Hibernian and Bournemouth were short-lived, as the drinking took priority over a career that eventually ended in 1984, when Best was 38 years old.
When he went to Fulham, he actually showed glimpses of what a great player he was. I remember him and Rodney Marsh messing about during one game, and he looked in good nick. He really got himself into shape again.
It was a roller coaster. Sometimes he was up, sometimes he was great and looked well and was well, and obviously they were the times when he was managing to keep off the drink, as we know. So, you know, you'd see him, and other times, you know, they wouldn't be so good.
I didn't drink, so I had no clue. I didn't know what an alcoholic was. And when I just thought he needed somebody to make a nice house and nest and cook dinner and settle down. Lesson learnt.
He did go to counselling, though, didn't he, for a while?
Please. He had an affair with one of the girls at counselling. God love him.
In retirement, the drinking tightened its grip. In 1986, after 8 years of marriage, Angie lost her patience and finally kicked out her husband.
I'm driving down the road and I'm being so careful because I've got my new little baby in the car. And I see in the middle of the road, walking down the white lines, and I remember thinking, oh my God, look at that poor man. As I got closer, it was my husband. And I thought, dear God, I can't do this. And I kept driving, took my son to wherever we were going, went home, and there he was on the couch, soaking wet, stunk to high heaven, snoring away. And that was it. I sent him home to England, where he then meets Miss World, forgets about his wife and newborn son, and starts up a wonderful relationship. Oh, you couldn't make this up, I swear to God.
Bankruptcy, arrests for drink driving, a spell in prison, an infamous spell on the Terry Wogan show, all pointed to a life out of control.
Terry, I like all right?
All right. So what do you do with your time these days? I see. Ladies and gentlemen, George Best.
Best was diagnosed with severe liver damage in 2000 and had a transplant 2 years later, prompting more promises to give up.
Are you going to drink again?
Yeah. I mean, I've said it a million times. I've said it a million times before. This is different.
But the drinking continued. In October 2005, Best was admitted into hospital with a kidney infection. A month later, aged 59, he was dead. The funeral in Belfast was a remarkable occasion, as thousands turned out to say goodbye to a man who was truly loved.
Even with rain pouring down, there was thousands of people there, you know. It was amazing, the amount of people. But he brought the two fractures together as well in Belfast.
George needed people to be tough on him, and nobody ever was, because it was George. Nobody wanted to piss him off. Nobody wanted to be mean to George. You had to be.
At the end of the day, George had an illness, which was a shame, and obviously, you know, they took his life, which was a great shame for a 59-year-old person of what he had done in his life. You know, the actual alcohol beat him.
It's like losing a member of your family, really. You do get close to people. In my case, you know, I felt particularly close to George. I've lost members of my family, and it's a similar sort of feeling. Just a horrible, terrible loss.
George Best was one of the finest players to ever pull on a football shirt. A man with faults and weaknesses, an ordinary man with an extraordinary gift. He certainly lived life to the fullest and was a man who, for good or bad, followed his own path. A true Maverick.
I actually think I was the greatest player of all time. I didn't just play long enough at the top. But the circumstances dictated that, you know, and I can't change it. And I was lucky. I had 11 great years, and it's 11 more than a lot of people did.